don't think so. I kind of overviewed what we talked about last week right here. And I mean, we've covered the nature topic, we covered the women covering her head, being this literal, pulling up. And we talked about feminine love versus belief. This was kind of our key point, takeaway of saying that this nature itself is, so I think we should
Like
just
this
quick
is,
review
this
this.
is, this is the, yeah, okay, that's what
This
I
is
wrote.
what we need to start
What
on that.
exactly does that mean?
Right, and so I think that's,
Is there such a thing as a symbol of authority today? What would that be?
yeah, I think,
What would mean, culturally, how would you do that? In our culture, I don't know how that would be done.
yeah, I think it's, we have some scriptural examples of that manner of speech, manner of carrying yourself, which I think is really all the time. That's quite a while. That's a good brainstorming question.
I'm gonna have to get some.
You know, what would that look like? I also found this interesting article, I don't know, it's not adding a lot, but it looked at the history of interpretation and gave four common thoughts about interpretation.
Oh, about the guardians, yeah,
About the
I mean,
angels.
I don't know about the angels thing, I don't understand that at all.
I don't completely agree with what's here, but I thought it's an interesting rule of thought for four areas of a lot of camps that people are in. I think they're worth reading.
Bad angels?
Yeah. It's interesting.
Bad angels are demons.
He's
isn't it?
telling
It is. They're going back to, well, they don't mention here, but they're referring to that passage of the Nephilim. Where did they come from? There's a lot of dispute, which I really don't want to get into this morning, but nonetheless.
But, yeah.
But the idea that the sons of God, or the angels of God, united with the women on the earth and created these race of giants that are Nephilim. So now,
Yeah, that's one theory.
yeah, all right. Yeah, it's one theory. It's one I don't really accept
I'm
yet.
not sure
Yeah.
about that one.
But nonetheless, they pull
I
back and
think
say.
the sons of God versus sons of man, it might be literally just Cain's son versus Abel's sons, the two lines of people, maybe.
Well, the one thing that does come from that passage is that regardless of whether it's angels of God, which it's hard to understand or make sense of, versus, or demons, versus men that have violated God's design, which says the sons of God, which are the men. So if those are the ones that basically violated God's design and were taking women in such a way that was not godly, which is why it was considered very negative at the time in the scriptures, then that fits in with this idea that, not really with the angels, but with the breaking of God's design. And I think that's one thing we take away from the passage, we can't really delineate what actually they meant by that. All right, I guess did you grab the candy?
I did.
There's not much left, none of it really matters, but
I put it up.
awesome, thank you.
As the selection goes down, it matters less and less. It's losing its potency.
It is, yes.
We're going to the store today.
For
I
you,
know, I
those
think
of
you need to
you,
put like $5 bills in there.
well, I'm not sure if we'll go that far, but
Better
those of you
candy.
who are
Better
faithful
candy.
and have come to get the candy, what candy would be preferable in there?
Right.
Please don't say carrot sticks, okay, because I don't consider that candy.
Unless it's.
Baby Ruth, I might manage that, I might manage that.
You have to ask the people who aren't here.
Yeah.
That's true, but, I'm gonna reward those who are coming, so. All right, we'll get to that a little bit. Why don't we get started? We're preparing, you want to do a quick review of what we talked about? or you want to do
Yeah,
it?
you want me to open with a prayer?
Okay, let's do that.
Father in heaven, thank you for this time that we have together, and we pray for those who are still on their way, that they would arrive safely, and that our discussion this morning would be productive and fruitful, and give us more insight into your word, and help us also just to learn as a group how to discuss these things, how to come to conclusions with difficult scriptural questions. And just pray that your Spirit would be with us this morning. And thank you for your love for us and for granting us this opportunity to just talk about these things. In Jesus' name.
Last week, we had one of the more challenging passages we wrestled through. I think we had some really good discussion, good understanding as we went through it. I'm just going to give some highlights of what we did discuss. I wrote them up here this morning just to kind of recap a little bit. If I've missed something or we need to adjust it, by all means, I'll speak up. We'll add some notes in, but I know it's kind of small and hard to read. I will read some of it to you, just an overview. But we began with talking about nature itself. It tells you that it's a disgrace for a man to have long hair, and we kind of fleshed out what does that mean. Particular passages for a man to wear his hair down. not so much long hair, but wearing his hair down was a sign in the culture of being effeminate or choosing a homosexual lifestyle. And so that particular cultural manifestation was in both Jewish culture, Greek culture, and Roman culture. And because of that, it gives you a little more sense to this idea of nature, because nature, the word itself, as we have looked through that, it comes from this physis word, which is the word we have for physics. And it's an elemental idea. And so we were struggling with the concept of how do you apply something that's elemental to the idea of having long hair. And someone brought up, well, if you don't cut your hair as a man, it's going to be long. So isn't that natural? Interesting idea. And so what does it mean to be natural? So part of the conclusions we got to was that it's not so much talking about the physical growth of the long hair, but it's the idea of what that expressed. That expression in that culture meant they had turned away from God's design and have went to something that was unnatural. From something that was natural or God's design to something that was unnatural, the choice of homosexuality. And that the same language we alluded to is repeated in Romans 1. And actually, I quote that Romans 1:26 and 27 uses some of the same language of natural versus unnatural and discusses through this parallel passage of sorts. So it really seems like they're talking here about the long hair is a homosexual context, that the men wearing their long hairs, or in other words, doesn't nature itself tell you that a man that chooses a homosexual lifestyle is wrong or unnatural? And so that's the context of that. We also then went back and began to discuss the women covering their head. This also has the actual literal translation is wearing her hair down versus having her hair up. And the best we can tell from the sources that you had and that we had was that this idea of a head covering is not so much a little beanie on the top of the head, but it was probably more in this culture something like a bonnet that would hold the hair up. And don't know exactly what that looks like, but what we can see from the times is that it represented, if you did not and you wore your hair down as a lady, it was something of looseness or promiscuity. And so the language used in this particular passage shows from, if you choose to take a loose wearing of your hair, loose as in sexually loose, then you might as well be like a prostitute. And so the prostitution, we also talked about this second part here, punishment for prostitution. If you were convicted in the court, you would shave your head. They would shave the women's head as a sign so that they would be embarrassed. When people saw them, it would represent that they had been convicted of prostitution. So it was a point of disgrace, and it was a punishment for prostitution. So part of this parallel language here seems to be Paul saying, if you're going to do something borderline, well, it's the same thing as something disgraceful. So if you're going to play borderline, you might as well go and have your head shaved and be punished for what this is. And so they're kind of doing this play on words of saying, and it's a very similar play on words than what Jesus used in the Sermon on the Mount. If you're talking about, they says, thou shalt not murder, yet I say don't even be angry with someone, because this is the seed of murder. And I think the same kind of concept is here, that if you wear your hair down in this society, that means that, hey, I'm open for possibilities here, have a loose awareness about my sexual direction, then you might as well call it what it is. It's the seed of prostitution. So that's kind of where our discussion went, and we were at that end point when we stepped into, we were about to step to this angels passage, which we'll get to in a second. And our conclusions we're drawing away from that was that, feminine men violate God's design or created order. Similarly, a loose woman violates God's design or created order, which is what makes this unnatural. So, based off Genesis 2, it talks about a woman being designed to be a suitable helper. The man shall leave the parents and cleave to the wife. You have this one man for one woman. This is the kind of design, this is the design that God expresses in his created order, and things that violate that are unnatural. And I believe a lot of this passage is coming from that. So before we step into the angels passage, are there any, and I will give one caveat, that what do these instructions mean to us? We need to answer that question. I'm holding it till after we talk about the angels passage and then talk about it all in context. I think that makes more sense. So any questions about what we have so far, disagreement on what I took away from our discussion? Did y'all take away something different? Yes, Cordelia.
So if I understand you right, it is a cultural thing with the long hair and the shaving of the head, because we don't do that anymore, but we going back to see why he was saying that, and that is going back to principles of the Bible. So the shaving and the long hair and all that doesn't culturally tell us anything. But if we go back into that place and time back then and look at it, what did it say then we come to the conclusion of what you have there on the left, that men shouldn't be feminine.
Feminine, yeah, sorry, feminine.
And that women shouldn't be loosely, in that way. So that's the biblical conclusion from the cultural concept that we studied with the view of the time back then.
I think, yes, I think that we're seeing the biblical principle that we're trying to understand, and it has an expression in the culture that was helping us, the more we understand the culture, we understand how they responded to the message, which was always true. And so we're trying to take that always true message and say, well, does that express itself the same in our culture? Does it express it slightly differently? Oh, how do we stay true to the message without, like, for example, if wearing your, like, we've already misinterpreted men wearing their hair down as long hair. We've interpreted women wearing their hair down or not wearing their hair down, wearing them up as a head covering. And so just the language that we've used to translate this gives us a new, trying to adhere to scriptures gives us new patterns and traditions that may not even represent what he was talking about. And so I think we have to understand what is God actually calling us to here, and then how does that look for our relationships. And so my answer is yes. I think I'm just adding more language around it, but yeah, I think we're converging on that understanding. Is there any more thoughts about that? More ways to slice it? Yeah.
So the next step would be taking that principle and looking at it in our culture now.
Absolutely, right. And the point in case here, if a woman has her head shaved, what's the first thing that pops in your mind today? Cancer. Right. So, and that was not an issue back then, was it?
Might have
Chemotherapy
been,
causes.
they didn't do that.
Well, we do have the things of the scabs and the other things that one of the curses that God puts out in Ecclesiastes. I'm drawing a blank right now. But the only thing we know is chemo is part of that response to that, or is chemo, right? It's the drugs that cause the hair to fall out. So that's unique to our culture, and it gives a completely different idea to that. So there are some fundamental principles, like, for example, cross-dressing is wrong. We know that from scriptures. Is wearing a dress wrong? Well, cross-dressing is wrong. Is wearing a dress wrong? Well, that depends upon what wearing a dress actually means. In Scottish culture, having a skirt for a man or a kilt actually is right. It's a formal way of dress. And there's nothing fundamental in it that says that is a woman. A man dressing like a woman is much the opposite. It's a man dressing like what a man should be. So in that culture, if a man chose not to wear a skirt for a formal occasion, it would say more negative than and it would say nothing about cross-dressing. So anyway, there is a cultural element here that we have to be aware of, but we also don't want for a second to lose what God is actually stating. We just want to understand that as well as we can, and so that we can make sure we honor it in the way we live it. Any complaints, questions, things to add? I want to make sure we're not stepping into dangerous ground. I don't think we are, but I want to be very careful. Myron,
I'm not trying to start on anything here, but I mean.
please do.
What is cross-dressing? If a leading teacher is wearing a tuxedo, I'm sorry, she still looks really feminine. So, it's a piece that if girls wearing pants, I mean,
Yeah.
women who wear pants is still like a woman.
Yeah. Today, women wearing pants, did they appear like men?
No.
No. Did they appear like men in the 50s? Absolutely. Absolutely. Read the first source documents in the 50s. You're going to find that this was part of a women's lib movement at that time. It was saying, I can do what you do and do it better, and they were getting the factories. There was a need there, and so the need may have driven, because the men are out at war, the women are taking over their jobs, and dresses were impractical to do the work, therefore they needed pants. And so that's a lot of what drove it, but then it pulled into the other areas so that the first women in church wearing pants certainly were abnormal, not normal. And so that's where you have this edge where it matters. And then nowadays, there's probably most of the women here are wearing pants. Are y'all going to help? Don't think so. I don't think that's what it meant.
So,
But, yes, good.
so what's interesting, however, and something that we maybe don't have to think about, is that you cannot change culture without being rebellious, at least not for a while. Because every time anything has changed, there's been some kind of an upheaval. The Industrial Revolution, there were factory burnings, women wearing pants started out as a very bad thing, guys not wearing ties. You know, there was a time when I first started my job, my first job back in the early 1980s, I was required to wear a tie. Now, I didn't meet customers, I wasn't really in a formal type business situation, like a Wall Street situation. I wasn't in that kind of business, and I'm still not. But at the time, the tradition of most of the high-tech companies in Boston was, if you were a highly paid employee, a technical guy like Chris and I are, you wore a tie every day to work. In fact, at Arthur D. Little, you had to wear a suit. The jacket and the pants had to match. Back in the early 80s, it was a three-piece suit for most people. But then what happened? Well, some of the higher-ups in the company who were of a more sort of liberal persuasion started to show up at meetings without ties. Some of the chief guys. And so they were outliers, but they were in a position of authority to be able to sort of buck the trend. And then eventually, over a period of years, now, I see like the really high up, very high up people in the company, well, at least in my old company, they didn't wear ties. The guy in charge of the whole place didn't wear a tie anymore. He'd show up with a turtleneck.
Mark
And
Zuckerberg
pants.
wearing shorts and
or
t-shirts,
or some of these famous people, that you see that are the top of these real high-end companies, and they look cool, like they're about ready to go on a ski trip. They don't wear ties and black suits anymore. So now we take pants on women for granted. But how did we get there? And I don't know. Is the Lord at work there somehow? I don't know.
Well, one comment I want to
How
bring
does
up.
that happen?
Well, one thing Jeff started with, which I want to point out, is that the changing of the trends is a sign of rebellion. And we're either rebelling, we have to rebel against culture sometimes. So sometimes that's a God-given responsibility. But sometimes rebelling against our culture is rebelling against God's law. That's a problem. So the rebellion in and of itself is according to where the rebellion is from. If we stand out in culture, that's right. If we stand out against God, that's wrong. And so that's the discernment we have to say when we're making these decisions. Yeah.
It is really a fine line. So we could say, okay, the women back then go to hell because they were wearing pants. The women today don't go to hell because they're wearing pants. I mean, I'm just really kind of making black and white here. But, so, yeah, and it's really hard. And then what else do people rebel and then in another 20, 30, 50, 60 years is normal, and how far do we then go away from God, and where is the line that we are too far and not too far? I mean, it's really just very blurry and very difficult.
Subjective.
To, yeah, I mean, I'm glad I can wear pants today without going to hell.
Well, I think,
Yeah, it's
I think Chris hit the nail on the head, and, you know, it's a matter of what the intent is and where the person's heart is. And, you know, ultimately, where we get into trouble sometimes with these things is that we can't judge a person's heart. And, you know, two people can do the same thing for different reasons, depending on their circumstances and even depending on their own conscience and what they believe. And so we have to be very careful about, oh, the first woman who showed up with pants, she's a sinner, you know, she's the one who started the problem. Not necessarily. You can't, I mean, unless you really know that person and really understand their heart and where they're coming from, you don't necessarily know. But on the other hand, we do have to consider, to some degree, which again is a matter of conscience, how much do we care about what people think? There's that. Like, the elders are supposed to be respected in the community. What does that mean exactly? You know, that implies some constraints, but what kind of constraints? And it's just hard. And that's why you need prayer, you need spirit, and you need what we're trying to do, which is honest communication. Well, this is where I'm coming from, you know, or oh, I'm not coming from here. If you don't know that, you can make really wrong assumptions.
Paul fleshes out this very fine line, talking about eating food sacrificed to idols. I mean, that's one of those classic examples where he's saying, if you're causing your brother, if you recognize this is not a problem, you have the freedom to do it. But if you recognize that it's causing your brother to stumble, don't do it for his sake, especially when you're around him. And matter of fact, if it's a big enough issue that it might affect you even if you're not around him, just don't do it all around, give it up. And so there's this sensitivity that fundamentally requires me knowing my brother. And that unity that we should be experiencing with one another, that if I should know that I'm offending you. And if I don't, I should figure it out and I should make a response. So if, let's say you were wearing pants and that was not allowed, and we all come to you or the elders come to you and say, Cordelia, I know you're from Switzerland, and that's a completely different place, but here, that's a sign of X, Y, Z, and you really shouldn't be doing that. Here's where the judgment comes in, that I say, you know, how would you respond to that? If you respond with, I didn't understand that, by all means, I will go change, even though I prefer this, I will happily fulfill this to honor to not have a hint of sexual immorality or a hint of whatever this is, I'll do it. That's a godly response. The other response that I think we often tend to have is, who are you to tell me how to dress? And that rebellious spirit, I think, is something that God doesn't like, and we see that over and over through scriptures. Now, it doesn't mean that the elders coming to you would be necessarily right, but there's a cultural relevance there that kind of demand things. And we run into that in the country. Even from down south, I came up here in Florida, you can wear shorts to church.
Right.
Because you wear shorts everywhere. And it's not considered wrong. When I came up here, that was not allowed. And granted, I hardly ever wore shorts anyways at that time, but nonetheless, there was a cultural just between a few states. Mixed swimming, fine in Florida for the most part. Up here, whew, no. A lot of issues I really don't want to talk about now because I have a lot of opinions on these things. But nonetheless, there's just cultural shifts in a small period of area. You see it, and you got to be aware of it, and you have to be sensitive to it, and you have to bring out what's true, and then respond in a way that doesn't alienate. Yeah.
Well, since you picked me as an example.
Sorry.
So I want to say something. No, I think you said there's, you know, the response, and I think that is pretty correct. But I think since I picked me and I was thinking, well, what would I say? I think I would like the elders by doing it. And to respect that I give it up because I humble myself and I don't want to cause anyone to have a problem. But I think that's important too. If it's said that is sin from the Bible, you know, kind of like a scripture, thou shalt not wear pants, that's not how it is. It is maybe not cultural, it's not appropriate in the setting, or it's not appropriate for whatever reasons, yes. So that they understand I'm doing it not because I think it's wrong to wear pants, but I think it's wrong to cause my brothers and sisters to stumble. And I think that would be important for the elders in that case to understand too, because otherwise they're sinning. Because otherwise they would put something on me that is not right, and they would be in the wrong place and would have to learn something from it. You know what I mean? It goes both ways.
We'd like elders to have that awareness to be able to differentiate
If
between.
they come to me with a wrong mindset, that is wrong
Sure.
in their place.
But your response would be the same either way.
Yeah, but
You-
but understand.
you would articulate the
I think
truth.
that is important.
Yeah, you would articulate the truth, but
Because later, I mean, because if it is not sin per se to wear pants, I think that would be my fear. If I'm saying, okay, I do that, then it would be preached, it is wrong to wear
Mhm.
pants. And it's not wrong to wear pants, but it's wrong to make your brothers and sisters stumble. So there's
Yeah,
a different message that.
there's two sides of this issue. One is the
But
side
at the
of the
bottom line, I
response.
would do it because I
Yeah.
trust in God and think if I cannot get that message across, one day they will learn.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Paul actually does, you know, when talking about the food thing, he does come right out and say, you know, that no food is unclean in and of itself. He does say that, and he also says, you know, why should I be judged by another man's conscience, which is part of what you're dealing with. So Paul does express the truth, and I think sometimes we're afraid to do that because, like you said, it's been preached and practiced for so long that people assume that it's a sin. And so if you just preach the truth, people get offended about that. Well, you shouldn't be offended by the truth because it's something you're not personally comfortable with. You know, but a lot of times, then that's where, you know, you kind of have to teach gently and be patient and wait for the Spirit to move, but not let go of the truth. Paul didn't let go of the truth. He just, you know, he accommodated where people were. And I remember years ago that an issue came up in a church I was in. We were talking about this, and they said, you know, yes, it is true that we need to respect the weak, but the weak need to be taught to be strong. And a lot of times we don't want to do that. We just want to hold to the tradition, let's just be safe. And then you don't really get a hold of the whole truth.
Let me throw out one other thing to think about on these messages. We don't necessarily need to talk much about it, but think back, well, let's go back. Let's say imagine living in the 1900s, or even in the early, in the...
I was born in the 1900s, Chris.
Early. You were not born in 1910 and 1920. So back in this range, 1910 and 1920. Imagine growing up in that culture, and then being transported to today. So let's say you're a 25-year-old in 1920, and then you're transported today. You're going to be overwhelmed by a lot of the technological changes. But imagine sitting in front and turning on a TV and watching 10 minutes of TV. What do you think would go through your mind?
How come they didn't have this when he was that age?
Let me remind you that the 25-year-old there was already an adult, not like our 25-year-olds today who are still children. But what do you think? Actually, it's clear to me. I don't. Maybe y'all disagree, but I think the first thing someone looking at a TV removed from time would say is, how in the world can you have all these naked people spread over the? This is evil, and then we turn it off.
The 20s were pretty wild.
That's why I said 1910.
I think there's probably instances in every era, in every time of something like that happening that caused rebellion, because before the Beatles, it was Elvis Presley, and before that, it was something, and before that, it was something.
What is it
Just once
today?
with TV and stuff, it's a lot more visible. But I think every culture and every time has new things. Otherwise, we'd still be back, like it was that
Absolutely.
years ago.
I agree.
Yeah, it really depends on what the intent is. I mean, there is a fine line between creativity and rebellion. And as somebody who loves art and music, I tend to be on the rebellious side, quite frankly. Sometimes my form of rebellion is to do things the old way, when you're not supposed to do it that way. Is that a sin? I mean, I personally don't think so.
According to who you're rebelling against, right?
I think writing traditional four-part harmony is not a sin. There are people in music schools who would not allow me to graduate if that was the only kind of music I produced. So,
Right. And so the question, once again, in this case, comes right back to, am I rebelling against God, or am I rebelling against some culture that needs to be changed? For God's sake. I mean, there's a fundamental, what is the motivation? And there's times where I think if we look at our areas of rebellion in our life, some are going to come down and say, hey, I'm rebelling against God here. I need to change what I'm doing. Other times it's, I'm rebelling against culture for the sake of God. I stand out. I'm like an alien in this culture, and that's the right thing to do. I do it gently and lovingly, but I should do it. There's other times we'll find areas of rebellion where it's like, why am I doing this? It's just my opinion. It's just my perspective. I'm bucking the system here. I'm not necessarily dishonoring God, but why am I bucking the system? Is there a real good reason for this? And if there's not, I got to question that. Maybe I'll find the good reason, and it reinstantiates it. But maybe I don't. Maybe I say, well, maybe I shouldn't waste so much energy fighting this. I should look more at was it Timothy, where it says I need to be at peace with those around me and not standing out, working quietly and peacefully, unless I need to. So, there's all these questions that have to be wrestled with, but once again, it's between me and God. I need to wrestle with it. I take advice, but I let God lead me in that process. But I certainly think we should ask the question. Yes, go ahead.
I have to say, what you two said really impressed me this morning. The one thing that you said, if there is a problem, don't suffocate it, or bring it up, discuss it, pray, let the Spirit work, and yeah, find a solution together. And what Jeff said earlier too, that right can be wrong and wrong can be right, and every instance is different. And you cannot say, well, this is always black and this is always white. You have to look. Two people doing the same thing, one can be right, one can be wrong. And I really, really think it's great of you that you have this attitude and teach us and bring this into the church, because I feel very safe with that. I feel like, wow, we can have different ideas, and I'm not judged, and I can be wrong, and I can learn, I can be right, and I can be heard. And maybe especially for a woman, and maybe a woman that has been a single woman for a long time, it was liberating. This is, wow, I feel like in a cloud in God's, you say loud, wow, yes, I'm safe. I'm safe. And that really.
Well, thank you. Let's read verse 10 of chapter 11. Let's actually give a little context. We read this before, but verse 10 is kind of our focus for a difficult passage here. But back up to 6, it's kind of in the middle of the passage, but gives us a context. For if a woman does not cover her head, let her also have her hair cut off. This is where we kind of ended last week. But if it is disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off, her head shaved, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to have his head covered, since he is the image and glory of God, but the woman is the glory of man. For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man. For indeed man was not created for the woman's sake, but woman for the man's sake. Therefore, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Then it moves into, however, it kind of mitigates a little, is that there's still responsibility both ways, which we've talked about. So focusing on verse 10, have you done any research? Have you thought through this? Have you read contextually, believed that you have an understanding or idea of what it means by a symbol of authority on her head and because of the angels? What are your thoughts? That's exactly what the commentary said. Very good, very good.
Difficult.
Yes,
I thought the angel can see us.
okay. The angels can see us. That's actually one of the things I've seen in the possible ideas is that the angels are watching us. You know, the First Peter passage, it says, angels long to look on these things of the coming of Jesus. They're watching and seeing how God works through this time. They're keeping an eye on things, so for their sake, we should do what's right. Right? Yes, what did?
And we can tempt angels with our behavior. We can actually do harm to angels with our behavior somehow.
Okay. Not familiar with that argument, but I'll hear it, yeah.
I was asking myself, why do angels see us? You know, there's a verse in the Bible that there are secrets even angels can see. Are they watching us to be noisy?
Yeah, nosy, yeah, they're trying to extract it out, yeah. Other thoughts? Let me read for you. This had the history of interpretation had 4 different interpretive ideas. One of them actually includes what you mentioned. I'll read them. I'm not espousing these. I think the answer is actually somewhere in between a few of these, but they're interesting, and they're where, as you study this, your mind might go. So, talks about the word angelos, which is, or angelos, loose here, which is a meaning fundamentally messenger. One of the interpretations, this word in the humans is in the human sense of messenger, is one of the interpretations. So some contextual support, 10 verse 32 and chapter 14 verse 23, to view these messengers as outsiders or envoys from other churches. Essentially, Paul is hoping to ensure that the Corinthian church does not embarrass themselves. So that is one argument made, that these angels or these messengers are not godly spiritual messengers, but are physical people that happen to be sitting in the churches and going around, and if you guys don't shape up and do it like God's designed, you're going to embarrass yourself among all these churches. We're going to dishonor the Word of God here. So that's one interpretation that's put out. Second interpretation that we've seen. The angels are, quote, guardians of the created order, end quote. Paul seems to be drawing on the creation tradition in establishing a cosmic hierarchy, and uses angels as the final justification for this hierarchy. He relies on Jewish tradition to solidify this connection, specifically Targum Pseudo-Jonathan to Genesis 1:26. I don't know what Targum Pseudo-Jonathan means. I don't know what that means. But nonetheless, Genesis 1:26, which perceives angels as the agents by which God effected creation. Quote, let us, end quote, is then these angels speaking. Only things we can argue with against that particular interpretation. But nonetheless, that's making the idea that angels are helping establish a created order, and if we violate that created order, because of the angels, they're the messengers of God to help make this happen. Third interpretation. As Mike mentioned, that's someone up before one of the questions, that this is dealing with angels' presence in the congregation of the community. Particular scholar was instrumental in identifying an earlier similar belief articulated in the Qumran, or the War Scroll specifically, and the Community Scroll, extending this. Angelic worship, that is the type of worship performed by angels, not the worship of angels, is most exemplary form of worship and worthy of imitation. Paul is relying on this perspective to reinforce the directives he's given as a means of working toward worshiping as the angels do. And so this is kind of a flip saying, as the angels praise God in heaven, so we too should honor God in an appropriate manner. So watch the angels, listen to read what they're doing, and make sure that we're doing things in a proper way. So that's kind of one of those arguments. A fourth argument. These are actually, quote, bad angels that Paul has in view. This is based on a Greco-Roman culture in which the female head and hair could be viewed as displays of sexuality and availability. The head covering was a means of maintaining order and reducing potential for lust, sexual angst within the male population, akin to forbidding mini-skirts in church now. The bad angels were angels who fell because they had sex with the beautiful daughters of men. As such, Paul is enjoining this upon them for their own protection from these angels. So now this is riddled with lots more bad theology and or questionable theology about the Nephilim in the Old Testament, that the sons of God or the angels of God, according to how you interpret it, have children with women on earth. They have children that are giants, or the Nephilim, and they were considered demons, possibly, or possibly men. There's lots of explanations out there. I'm not going to go into it this morning, but nonetheless saying these angels are bad angels, so if you do it wrong, you're just like the bad angels doing it wrong too. So that's roughly the four possible historical interpretations. There may be more. I think there are more. I have one more, but yes.
There is this, I don't know where it is. Sometimes if you have an open house, if you take care of guests, sometimes the Bible says you have taken care of angels.
Unaware,
so they must be among us. Maybe that's not a strange thing. It is.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, the possibility that there's angels among us, and that's including the worship, that they're here as guardians or with us, or yeah. That's part of that possible solution. So there's some food for thought. We are out of time, so I'm going to leave you with some of those food for thoughts. Believe me, I can argue with every one of these, and I have problems with every one of these, and I expect you to also. Don't misunderstand me as saying, hey, here's 4 possible answers. I don't think they're all possible answers. But nonetheless, I'd like for you to think about it. Maybe next week we'll pick up with angels and come back with your theories, your ideas of how do we make sense of this? What is it really calling me and you to be? And how do angels impact that? And specifically, what does that sign of authority mean? And we're gonna go from that conversation and step right into this fundamental question: what do these instructions in general, all of these instructions, mean to us today? And so I think that's. Got anything else to add before we close out? All right. Any questions? Y'all understand your homework? I miss where you're all jotting it down, so you make sure you don't miss it. So let me repeat it just in case you want to think about what the angels represent and what the sign of authority means. Also think about how do all of these instructions impact you and I. What does it mean today to live this way? With the headship that's described in the passage, and with the cultural manifestations that we're sorting out through here. All of the, one last comment about the videos. All the videos are on the web, on the Melrose Church of Christ YouTube page. Dad is translating a few of those over, and we're getting them all up on our main website. We've still got a few that need to be traveled over. Those will hopefully be done this week. But if you go up there and say, hey, where was this past week? It usually takes me most of the week to get them up there. But nonetheless, if you're talking before a week away, most likely they're all up there from last week and before. You can go to the YouTube page if you don't see them on our Church of Christ page. And you can get a link, actually on our website, it has a link to the YouTube page, and it will have all of these videos. They're there for your use. If you hear something, he says, wait a second, what was he saying there? Go look it up. Watch the video. It's 45 minutes, 55 when we're long-winded. But nonetheless, it's all there. We can talk through it, we can wrestle with it, and if you disagree with us, very likely we disagree with ourselves when we go back and listen to the same videos. So we want to flesh those things out. All right, let's pray. Holy Father, I thank you for your patience with us. I thank you for this body that you've given us to sharpen one another, to wrestle with your word. Give us insight, please. Help us to understand your instructions and where you are leading us, how to honor you to worship you, how to understand this passage about the angels and the sign of authority on a woman's head. Lord, help us to interpret this as you intend, and the way that shines your light into not only our hearts, but the culture around us that so desperately need you. May you be honored in all things, Lord. In your Son, Jesus, I pray. Amen. Thank you.